My name is Elsie Marie Carter. I'm 74 years old, and though my hands tremble a bit when I quilt in the afternoons, they still remember more than I wish they did. Behind my large, old-fashioned glasses, there's a shadow most people never notice. Folks wave to me on Main Street as if I'm just the sweet lady who sells homemade pies at the Saturday farmer's market. But there are parts of me that never left that small bedroom that smelled of fear. Today, for the first time in over half a century, I've decided to unlock that room in my mind. I'm doing it with my heart in my throat, but with the certainty that I can't keep quiet anymore. I chose to tell this story not because I feel strong, but because I no longer have the strength to hide it. At my age, your back curves not just from years, but from the weight of unspoken memories. I've carried this secret like a hot coal pressed under my tongue. But now I feel that the girl I used to be, the one who dreamed of becoming a teacher, who protected her brothers, who scribbled stories on scraps of paper, deserves to be heard, even if the only one listening is me. Some wounds don't bleed on the outside, but they seep inside day after day, as if time doesn't know how to heal them. I grew up thinking silence was protection, that if I didn't speak, no one would get hurt. But that's not true. Silence can be a prison, and I've lived behind its bars for too long. This story, more than a confession, is a release. It's my way of telling the world and myself that what happened was real, that it hurt, and that it still hurts, but that there's light after all that darkness. Many look at me and think I'm just a grandmother like any other, that my life has been quiet, my days filled with the smell of fresh bread and the hum of a sewing machine. They can't imagine there were nights I prayed not to wake up. Children who cry in silence, like I once did, deserve to know they are not alone. Maybe that's why I've chosen to speak now. Not to reopen the wound, but to turn it into a bridge toward hope, understanding, and the kind of emotional justice I never had. Before I begin, I want to ask something from the bottom of my heart. If this story touches you in any way, please like this video and subscribe. It helps me keep sharing stories like this, ones that are hard to tell but necessary to hear. And tell me, where are you listening from? I'd love to know. Now, let me take you back to how my world was before it all fell apart. Because once, a long time ago, I was a happy little girl. My childhood unfolded in a tiny town in rural Kansas, surrounded by endless fields of golden wheat that swayed in the wind like they were waving hello to the sky. Our street was just packed dirt, and the houses were low and painted in faded colors, their porches creaking under rocking chairs that seemed to sway on their own. We lived in a small white clapboard house with peeling paint. We didn't have much, but back then I believed we had everything. A roof that kept us dry, my mother's warm hands, and the distant whistle of my father coming home from the fields at sundown. Mornings began with the ringing of the church bell and the sound of roosters crowing. Mama, always wearing her floral apron, would make us toast with butter and sprinkle it with sugar, while she braided my hair and straightened my brother's shirts before school. I, being the oldest, walked my two younger brothers, Frank and Michael, down the dusty road, dodging puddles after rain and waving to every neighbor we passed. That simple routine made me feel safe, as if the world were a kind, predictable place. Sundays were special. We put on our cleanest clothes and walked together to the little Baptist church on Main Street. After the service, Daddy would chat with the men about crops, while Mama exchanged recipes and gossip with the other women. We kids played near the big oak tree, climbing its branches until Mama called us down. Sometimes Daddy would buy a paper sack of roasted peanuts, and we'd pass it around, taking turns cracking them open. In those hours, I forgot any worry and felt part of something bigger, a family that belonged to each other and to our small town. I remember the smell of laundry drying on the clothesline, sheets flapping in the summer breeze like sails. Mama sang old gospel hymns as she sewed, and I'd watch her nimble fingers stitch torn shirts until they looked brand new. Frank and Michael played marbles or chased grasshoppers, while I made up stories to tell them, inspired by the shapes of clouds drifting slowly overhead. Time seemed to stretch back then, each day full of little certainties. Winter nights were my favorite. We'd gather around the pot-belly stove, Mama telling stories she'd learned from her grandmother, while Daddy nodded quietly, smiling in that way that made me feel like everything was all right. The crackle of burning wood was like a heartbeat that kept us together. I'd fall asleep believing nothing could touch us. Sometimes in the summer we'd go down to the creek. The water was clear and cool, reflecting the sky like a mirror, and tall cattails swayed at the edge. I taught my brothers how to swim there, laughing when Michael splashed clumsily. We brought along sandwiches wrapped in wax paper and ate under the shade of cottonwood trees, heading home with dusty feet and light hearts. At school, I was a good student. I loved to read, and my teacher, Mrs. Peterson, often let me read aloud because she said I had expression in my voice. It made me feel proud, like maybe I could be someone important someday. I dreamed of going to a bigger school in the city, though I knew it wouldn't be easy. Still, as long as I had books and notebooks, I felt capable of anything. Life in town had its own slow rhythm. Men came back from the fields at dusk, women gathered on porches to chat and sew, and kids ran free until mothers called from doorways. The sound of those calls was like an invisible thread pulling us home. We didn't live by clocks, only by the sunlight and the song of crickets. On the 4th of July, the whole town gathered by the fairgrounds for music, pie contests, and fireworks. We'd roast corn over open flames, and Daddy once hoisted me onto his shoulders so I could see the colorful bursts in the sky. He was a man of few words, but in moments like that, his presence felt like the safest place in the world. Our house was always alive, with sounds, birds singing in the morning, Mama's sewing machine clicking, my brother's bare feet pounding across the floor. I thought that harmony would last forever. No one had told me that life could break without warning. If I close my eyes, I can still see our kitchen table with its red and white checkered oilcloth and hear the clink of spoons in milk glasses. That table saw laughter, silly arguments, and dreams for the future. I didn't know then that it would also witness tears I couldn't explain. Back then, my biggest worry was Michael stealing my slice of pie, or Frank breaking one of my rag dolls. We were happy in our ignorance, thinking the world was no bigger than our small town, and that nothing bad could find its way in. That last summer before the storm was especially bright. We played in the creek more than ever, helped Daddy in the fields, and Mama taught me how to bake bread. I kneaded the dough awkwardly, but she smiled like I was doing it perfectly. I didn't know it then, but those moments were the true treasures of my life, and they were about to become only memories. The change came on a night that looked like any other. It was August, and the heat still clung to the walls long after sunset. Mama complained of a strange pain in her chest while clearing the table. We thought it was just tiredness, but her hands shook, and her breathing grew short. Daddy, frowning, helped her to bed. But before dawn, he decided to get the truck and drive her to the small hospital in the next county. I stayed behind with my brothers, trying to hide my fear under a calm voice. The next morning, a neighbor came to tell us Mama had been taken to the city hospital. She never came back. The news of her passing hit like a rock through glass, quiet at first, then cracking everything around it. I remember the little white church filled with mourners, the scent of lilies and old wood, and the women whispering, "So young, such a good woman." I held Frank's hand, while Michael cried into my dress. Daddy didn't shed a tear. He just stared at the floor, his lips pressed tight. Part of me hoped life would somehow go back to what it was. But deep down, I knew something had been shattered forever. In the days after, the house felt hollow. The silence was so thick you could almost touch it. I tried to keep Mama's routines alive, cooking, folding laundry, keeping my brothers clean. But the food didn't taste the same. The clothes didn't smell like her. Neighbors brought casseroles and pies, offered to help, but Daddy waved them away with a curt nod. He told me we didn't have time for crying, that I needed to be strong. Tears felt like a luxury we could no longer afford. About a week later, a man showed up claiming to be a distant cousin of Daddy's. His name was Mr. Earl, and he came from another state. He wore a weathered hat and carried a scuffed leather suitcase. He said he'd be staying to help out. At first, I thought maybe it would be a good thing that another adult in the house would make things easier. He spoke in a deep, steady voice and smiled at everyone. Folks in town said he was polite and well-mannered, but his eyes, there was something in them that made me uneasy, though I couldn't say why. Daddy started spending more time out in the fields, leaving the house in Earl's hands. Earl sat at the head of the table like he belonged there, gave me chores in a tone that sounded polite, but didn't leave room for refusal. I'd catch him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking. His compliments about how well I worked carried a weight I couldn't name, but it settled in my stomach like a stone. One afternoon, while I was hanging laundry, Earl came up behind me and touched my shoulder. It wasn't rough, but there was something in the way his hand lingered that made me feel trapped. He said I was a responsible young lady, and that Mama would be proud of me. I smiled politely, but inside I felt cold all over. That night, I moved my bed against the wall and stacked chairs against my door, even though I knew it wouldn't stop anyone who really wanted to come in. That's when I understood. Mama's absence had left a space in our home, and a shadow had already begun to fill it. A shadow patient enough to wait for its moment. Earl soon became part of every corner of our lives. He woke earlier than everyone else, and made the coffee like he owned the kitchen. At first his presence seemed like help for Daddy, but it quickly became a constant we couldn't escape. He moved through the house as if every wall belonged to him, and his voice carried even when he spoke softly. He called me kid, in a tone that wasn't exactly friendly or paternal. It was something else, something that made me tighten inside. He started taking too much interest in what I did. He'd ask what time I left and got back from school, what chores I had, what I planned to do after supper. If he saw me talking to a neighbor, he'd appear, suddenly ending the conversation. He claimed it was to keep me safe, saying the world was full of dangers. But I felt the real danger was inside our own home. My brothers, too young to understand, liked him well enough, sometimes even playing catch with him in the yard. There were little things no one else would notice, but they made my skin crawl. A hand resting on my back too long, a brush by accident as we passed in the narrow hallway, a look that lingered where it shouldn't. Every time it happened, I'd hold my breath and find some excuse to leave. I knew I couldn't tell Daddy. He was exhausted, distracted, and I feared he wouldn't believe me. Earl began setting rules. I couldn't go anywhere alone, had to finish my chores before anything else, and had to tell him if I went to the creek with the boys, if I didn't follow his orders. His voice hardened and his eyes went cold. He never raised his hand, but his authority hung over me like a heavy chain. At 13, I started, feeling like a prisoner in my own home. One evening, while I was peeling potatoes, he came up close behind me. I felt his breath on the back of my neck as he said I was the little woman of the house now. He smiled when he said it, but the tone made me freeze. I kept peeling as if nothing had happened, my hands trembling. That night, I moved my bed even tighter into the corner and jammed a chair under the doorknob. Sometimes he'd bring me gifts, a scarf, a notebook, candy from his pocket. He said it was because I'd been good, but I knew better. I'd mumble thanks and hide them away, each one a silent reminder that he expected something in return. He began coming into my room under the excuse of checking if everything was neat. He'd touch my books, my rag dolls, open drawers without asking. His hands were never still, and I'd stand frozen staring at the floor, waiting for him to leave. I took comfort only in the fact that my brothers were never present during these visits. Before long, he started making sure we were alone. He'd send my brothers on errands, then call me to help with something that didn't really require two people. He'd always find a way to close the space between us, trapping me without it looking like it. That subtlety made it even more terrifying. No one else could see it, and that invisibility gave him power. In public, his mask was perfect. He greeted folks with a smile, helped at church events, and even brought treats to my teacher to thank her for her hard work. People liked him, and that made me feel even more alone. Who would believe me if I said that behind that smile lived someone else entirely? I remember one rainy afternoon. Daddy was stuck out in the fields. The boys were asleep, and Earl called me into the living room to talk. He spoke about life, work, and how a woman should behave. His voice was calm, but every word dripped with control. When I tried to stand, he gripped my arm, not enough to bruise, but enough to make it clear I wasn't free to leave. The sense of confinement grew. I stopped laughing, stopped running through the yard, stopped going to the creek. Even at school, I couldn't focus. I made myself invisible, thinking maybe if I took up less space, he'd lose interest. Friends asked why I was so quiet, and I gave excuses. It was easier than trying to explain the unexplainable. I began sleeping with a small pocket knife under my pillow, not because I truly believed I'd use it, but because holding it gave me a fragile sense of defense. I trained my ears to recognize every sound in the night. The difference between the house settling and his footsteps near my door. I lived in constant tension, my body ready to flee or resist at any second. One afternoon, while I was sweeping the porch, he told me, "Everything in this house goes through me." He said it with a smile, but his eyes stayed flat and cold. I knew it wasn't just a statement, it was a warning. In his mind, I was part of what he owned. The mask of the helpful, protective man stayed firmly in place for everyone else. But for me, each day made it more obvious that what had entered our home wasn't help at all. It was a threat feeding off my silence, and I still had no idea how to break it. I started living each day as if I were following an invisible script. I'd wake before everyone else, make breakfast, dress my brothers, and clean the house without being asked. The more I stayed ahead of the chores, the fewer excuses Earl would have to come near me. It was my quiet strategy, a way to avoid catching his attention. But no matter how much I did, he always found a reason. My body began reacting before my mind could. I'd jump at footsteps behind me, even if they were just Frank or Michael. I began wearing clothes that were too big, hiding my growing figure under baggy shirts and long skirts. In summer, when other girls wore light cotton dresses, I stayed in heavy blouses and jeans, claiming it was to keep away the bugs. In truth, it was to disappear. Sleep became a rare luxury. Nights were spent half awake, listening for every creak of the floorboards, every slam of wind against the shutters. Sometimes I'd sit up in bed with a small pocket knife in my hand until dawn broke. My brothers slept deeply, blissfully unaware of the tension that filled the house. Even school stopped being a refuge. Earl began walking us there to make sure we got in safe. I knew it wasn't safety he was after. It was to remind me that his watch followed me beyond the house. At recess, I stayed close to the wall, always aware of his presence waiting outside. I spoke less and less. My answers became short, my eyes fixed on the floor. I learned to measure my words carefully so they wouldn't change his tone. Silence became both my shield and my prison. I told myself that if I didn't speak, I could control what happened. Earl found other ways to keep control without raising a hand. Sometimes he'd tell Daddy I wasn't keeping up with my chores, even when it was a lie. When Daddy came home, worn out and angry, he didn't ask for my side. He just scolded me. I learned quickly there was no room to defend myself. I clung to small routines to stay sane. Washing clothes in the sink, sweeping the porch, peeling potatoes. The repetition let my mind go blank for a little while. But as soon as the chore was done, the tension crept back in. Market days were the worst. Daddy would leave Earl in charge while he went to sell crops. Earl would wander the house like a wolf, checking his territory. He'd step into the kitchen, then into my brother's room, then into mine, always with some excuse. Making sure you're keeping tidy, just checking on things. I learned to move fast and stay in open spaces near my brothers. Sometimes I'd try to convince myself I was imagining it, that maybe I was reading too much into his behavior. But all it took was one look, one lingering touch, to remind me it was real. My gut told me I was in danger, and I trusted that instinct. My brothers started noticing I was different. Frank once asked why I didn't go to the creek with them anymore. I told him I was tired, that there was too much work. I couldn't tell them the truth. My job was to protect them, even if it meant carrying the weight alone. The days all looked the same. Wake, work, watch, hide, try to sleep. There was no room for laughter or dreams. Even the colors outside seemed duller. The sky less blue, the flowers less bright. It was as if the world had dimmed. When Earl left the house, I felt my shoulders drop in relief. I could breathe a little easier, talk a bit more with my brothers. But the moment I heard the door open, it was like a shadow fell back over me. Once, he caught me writing in a notebook I'd hidden under my bed. He didn't yell. He just flipped through the pages, then set it down with a crooked smile. No words, just that look. I knew then it was a warning. He was aware of the thoughts I kept to myself. I stopped writing after that. Bruises began to appear on my arms, the kind people didn't question in those days. I'd hide them under long sleeves or clumsy bandages. I made up stories to explain them. A fall, a bump against the table, rough housing with my brothers. No one doubted me. I learned to calculate every move, every sentence, every glance. It was constant, invisible work, and it drained me. The fear had woven itself into my skin. I couldn't see an escape, only the dull hope that one day something would break the pattern. What kept me going was a silent promise I made to myself each night. As long as I was there, Frank and Michael wouldn't go through what I was enduring. I didn't know how I'd keep that promise, but it was my only certainty. I had mastered the art of disappearing without moving, of existing without making a sound. I'd become a ghost in my own home, waiting for the day I could be a person again. That day felt far away, but I held on to the belief that it would come. I began watching Earl the way someone studies a dangerous animal. I couldn't stop him, but I could learn his habits and anticipate his moves. I noticed which days he drank more, when his mood was lighter, and when his voice sharpened like a knife. Over time, I realized that after heavy meals he grew slower, less alert. Those were the moments I'd steal small breaks, quick walks outside, an extra minute hanging laundry, little pockets of air that helped me breathe. One afternoon, while I was pinning sheets on the clothesline, I caught the gaze of our new neighbor, Mrs. Collins. She had sharp, kind eyes and a voice that always sounded warm. She offered me a slice of pound cake over the fence, and as I reached for it, she whispered, "If you ever need anything, I'm right here." She didn't ask questions, but her look told me she'd seen more than I realized. I wrapped a piece of that cake in a napkin and kept it in my pocket all day, like a charm. School also became a quiet shelter. My teacher, Mrs. Peterson, started to notice that I was different. One day after class, she asked me to stay and help organize the reading books. Without looking directly at me, she said, "My door is always open if you need to talk." I didn't answer, but her words planted something inside me. The thought that maybe I wasn't completely alone. At home, I began creating excuses to keep my brothers close. If Earl sent them into town for something, I'd insist on going along. If he tried to have me stay behind to help him, I'd fake a stomachache or claim the boys needed me. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But every time I managed to avoid being alone with him, it felt like a small victory. I also started writing again, but more carefully. I used loose scraps of paper and hid them inside an old Sunday school Bible Earl never touched. I didn't just write my fears. I made plans. What to do if he tried to enter my room, what to say if someone noticed. Something, which route to take to get to Mrs. Collins's house fastest. They were small strategies, but they gave me a thread of control. My brothers, without knowing it, became my greatest shield. I taught them games that kept us together. Races to see who could gather firewood fastest, contests to see who set the table best. It meant Earl had fewer chances to corner me. After a while, they even began to question his rules, asking why we couldn't go to the creek alone or why he gave me different instructions than them. I noticed Earl didn't like being ignored. When I kept my answers short and my face blank, his attention sometimes faded. I learned to hide my fear so he wouldn't get the satisfaction of seeing it. It was exhausting, but it kept him off balance. As I got older, his control seemed more threatened by the independence he could see coming. He'd comment that I was turning into a young woman and needed to be watched more closely. His words made my stomach turn, but they also told me something important. He knew I was changing, and that made him uneasy. And in his unease, I saw my first real opening. I knew I couldn't confront him yet, but quietly, I was gathering strength, allies, and plans. Every look from Mrs. Collins, every quiet offer from Mrs. Peterson, every day I kept my brothers within arm's reach. They were all bricks in the invisible wall I was building between him and me, a wall no one else could see, but one that was getting stronger. The night it all came to a head didn't start with yelling or slamming doors. It began with a heavy silence that told me exactly what was coming. Daddy had left early that morning to spend the night watching over the harvest. My brothers were asleep in the room next to mine, and I was in the kitchen mending a tear in one of Michael's shirts under the dim glow of the kerosene lamp. Earl stepped in without a sound, but his shadow stretched across the wall before I even looked up. He walked over, slowly, asking where Daddy was, with a voice that was far too calm. I told him he'd be back by morning, trying to keep my tone steady. Then Earl smiled, that slow, dangerous smile, and said this meant we could talk without interruptions. My stomach tightened, but I kept sewing, as if the needle in my hands could keep him away. He set his hat on the table and began circling me, speaking about nothing in particular but moving closer each time. When his hand landed on my shoulder, I stood, quickly, and pretended I needed to check on the boys. He stepped in front of me, his smile gone, his eyes cold and fixed. Time slowed. My mind raced through every note I'd written and every plan I'd hidden in my Bible. I remembered my promise, that I'd never let him touch my brothers, and I knew that tonight I'd do whatever it took to keep it. I drew a slow breath, feeling the small pocket knife tucked into my apron. "You're going to do what I say," he whispered. But something inside me stopped, shaking. I leaned back slightly, making him think I was stepping away, then shoved past him hard, surprising even myself. His breath caught behind me, but I didn't look back. I ran straight to my brother's room and locked the door. Sitting against it, I shouted that if he tried to come in, I'd wake the whole neighborhood and that I'd run to Mrs. Collins's house before he could stop me. He knocked first, then pounded harder. My heart felt like it would burst, but I kept my voice firm, repeating the threats until his knocking stopped. I heard his boots on the floor, then the front door slamming. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my back to the door, Frank and Michael curled up beside me, waiting for the first sign of dawn. And when it came, I knew this wasn't something I could survive by hiding anymore. It was time to put the plan I'd been building for months into motion. The fear was still there, but now, so was resolve. At first light, before Daddy returned from the fields, I woke. Frank and Michael. I told them to get dressed quickly and not ask questions. I packed a couple of changes of clothes into a canvas bag, along with my pocket knife and the notebook I'd kept hidden for so long. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. I opened the front door slowly, half expecting Earl to be there, but the house was empty. We crossed the yard without a sound, heading toward the dirt road that led into town. I didn't glance back once. Every step felt like I was breaking a chain that had held us too long. When we passed Mrs. Collins's house, she spotted us and came out onto her porch. Without a word, she walked with us to the edge of the road, her quiet presence like a shield I didn't know I needed. We made it to the bus station in the next town over. I bought 3 tickets to the city where my mother's sister, Aunt Margaret, lived. I didn't have much money, but it was enough to get us there. On the bus ride, I held my brother's hands and kept telling them everything was going to be all right. I don't know if they believed me, but I needed to say it for them and for myself. When we arrived, Aunt Margaret didn't push for details. She just pulled us into a hug and told us we were safe now. In that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. Family isn't always just who you're born to, but the ones who open their doors when you have nowhere else to go. Even now, decades later, I still feel a lump in my throat when I think about that morning. But alongside the fear, there's pride. Pride in the girl I was, who found the courage to protect the ones she loved. If this story touched you, please like this video and subscribe. It helps me keep sharing stories that might be a light for someone still living in the dark. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had to find more courage than you thought you had?